Worship is not so much a personal spiritual experience as it is about living a life in sacrifice to God. A few weeks ago, when it became apparent that Greg and I were on consecutive Sunday mornings, we got together and compared notes. And I asked him what he was planning to speak on, and he said that he was going to talk on worship from 1 Corinthians chapter 12, a book that we delved into very deeply during my biblical education. And chapter 12 is a very interesting chapter, but it's not, you have to look a bit deeper for the connection to worship. And so when Greg said this to me, I went, deep. More than that, I went further and thought, speaking the following week, that's just brilliant because I can carry on into chapter 13 and chapter 14, and I was thinking, this sermon is going to write itself. Now, for those of you who were here and present last week, you'll know that Greg did indeed preach on worship, and he did indeed use chapter 12, but he was nowhere near the book of 1 Corinthians, leaving me with a far harder job to do about how I connect what I was planning to do this morning with what he did last week. And now Greg and I had caught up and we had unpacked that minor misunderstanding, but that was not before I felt like I was committed to talking the book of 1 Corinthians. So let me start the job of connecting the two sermons and the two ideas that we've got together. And Millie, I just wonder if you can put up for me on stage those two words. And this is what Greg talked through last week. Therefore, worship. I'm not going to unpack the therefore this morning. I'm going to take a look at the worship and we're going to unpack that and move with it. I have only one Greek word for you this morning, church, so just bear with me. And I want to take a look at this word that we've got, worship. Now, this is not a very common word in the New Testament that we have in Greek. And at least as much as it means to worship, it also means to serve. There's a sense of the divine responsibility that's coming out in this word. One of the places it's used is in Hebrews chapter 9, where we're talking about the duties, the responsibilities, the actual physical things that the high priest has to do. Now, there's no doubt that God's being served here. Another place where this word is used is in the book of John, where Jesus talks to his disciples and says that those people who kill you will think that they're doing a holy service to God, a holy worship to God, if you like, if I follow this word. But the idea is that there's a very a task-oriented aspect to this word. So at least as much as we can use the word worship here, we should also use the word serve. Therefore worship, therefore serve. Now, with that comment, I'm going to finish in the book of Romans, and we're going to move to where I'm planning to be this morning, the book of 1 Corinthians. Now, one very small point of order, I am not going to read it because what I'm talking on covers at least 3 chapters, and I'd finish reading it and then I would sit down. Now, maybe that would be edifying and maybe that would be building people up. Rick might be having a word to me about my choices and preparation of sermons, though. Back in the early days of Facebook, sort of, 2008, 2009, 2010 kind of era. Now, if you really want to be technical on me, Facebook was earlier than that, but this is when I remember it happening. There were all of these quizzes that you could do as part of, really sucking people in. And it was like, well, which Harry Potter character are you? And you fill in a quiz and it tells you that you're Dumbledore or somebody. Or you fill it, which Avenger are you? And you fill in a quiz and it tells you that you're Hulk, or I don't know, and then you post your results and everybody likes it or says, no, that's crazy, or something along those lines. Now, I did consider playing this game with Hills Church this morning, and we go, which New Testament church are you? Now, I kind of started down this idea and abandoned it very quickly because there's quite a few New Testament churches. It would take quite a few questions for us to get through it. But and at the end of the day, I really only have one point here, which is that if we're comparing ourselves to New Testament churches, we compare far closer to the church at Rome than we do to the church at 1 Corinthians. Okay? Let me illustrate a little bit. If they were people, Romans would be relatively well-dressed, relatively intellectual, probably an executive-type job, went to university, and has spent a significant amount of time in sort of leadership, okay? The church at 1 Corinthians would probably be a tradesman working with his hands, street smart rather than book smart, very aware of things and how things work together, deeply hungry for the spiritual, relatively gregarious. The clothing would not be, sort of there to look as there to be functional and there to actually work with whatever they're doing. Let me try and bring this home in another way. I think Greg was absolutely the right guy to be speaking on the book of Romans, okay? Quite intellectual, and he picked a very, a good idea, intelligently unpacked it, and really worked it through. In many respects, taking that comparison, I am the wrong guy to be talking on 1 Corinthians, okay? I would be far better suited to the book of Romans. But such that I do, I might have a little bit of insight to offer, and we will get there. In many ways, 1 Corinthians is a totally different book to the book of Romans, okay? Greg started last week with the word therefore. Romans is deeply interconnected. If you start in at any one point, you're liable to get lost very, very quickly. You kind of need to assemble your whole argument. You can dive into 1 Corinthians at just about any point and get a sense of what's going on. It's not nearly as interconnected as Romans is at face value, I will hasten to add there. Now, the Corinthian church did not need any theoretical basis for worship. You would not preach a sermon, therefore worship, at 1 Corinthians. They had gotten the idea that you needed to worship. They had gone in, guns blazing, boots and all, pick your metaphor, I haven't got a great one. And what seems to have been happening was a certain amount of chaos and mayhem. What they needed, though, was some very definitive guidelines on how they should be worshipping so that their worship didn't damage their fellow Christians. And make no mistake, their worship was proving damaging. They'd understood that they needed to worship, and church, they were into it, and they were into it big time, but they had forgotten something very key, which is that worship is not so much a personal spiritual experience as it is about living a life in sacrifice to God. Specifically in the meetings of the church, worship is not so much about a personal spiritual experience, it's about how you build up your fellow Christians. Now, the first you see this in the section of 1 Corinthians that I'm looking at is in chapter 12 and verse 7. The Spirit becomes present and obvious in each of us for the benefit of everyone. Okay, the key idea being that mutual benefit that we have got there. Now, ostensibly, this first part of chapter 12 is a section on spiritual gifts, but the point here is that those spiritual gifts come to benefit everybody in the context of worship. Now, in a later chapter, and this later chapter does continue the section that we're working on, we have 1 Corinthians 14 and verse 5. For prophecy is greater than speaking in tongues unless somebody interprets what you are saying so that the whole church will be built up. And Paul makes this point over and over again during this passage. And so at this point, we need to take another look at our graphic and enlarge our understanding. Therefore, worship. We have that basis that we need. And we've looked at the word worship and we've unpacked it, and it also means to serve. But something happens when I say therefore serve, because you don't need me to convince you that worship goes to God, okay? But when I say to serve, suddenly it's a little bit unclear. In translation, that's what we call implicit information. And so it's quite clear, though, in those examples about this word that we've got, that the word that we have got for worship, that service goes to God, But it's equally clear from 1 Corinthians this morning that that service also needs to go to those of us who are around us. So, therefore worship, which we have already unpacked, therefore serve, which means therefore serve God. Let's keep it, I think, one more, Millie, thanks. Next one. Yep, that's it there. So therefore serve God, okay? God is absolutely implied in who we're serving. And like I said, it is key from 1 Corinthians that we need to also serve one another. Okay? Our gifts, our worship comes in a way of serving one another. Now, I want to hasten to add, and especially after the service that we've had this morning, and Ranjit, you did a great job leading us into the presence of God. Paul also values that personal connection with God, that personal spiritual experience. And we have him saying this in 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and verse 18, where he says, I thank God that I speak in tongues more than all of you. Now, it's not so much speaking in tongues, but Paul talks and he unpacks about that speaking in tongues, that it's a way of praying in the Spirit, of connecting with God in a very deep way, but that nobody else around can understand. And in their search for that personal spiritual experience, the Corinthian church had forgotten something even more important, their fellow Christians. So, now I mentioned earlier on that that letter of 1 Corinthians is not deeply interconnected at face value, but what you've got happening is the same problem kind of over and over again. They were deeply hungry for that spiritual experience. They were deeply hungry to connect with God in a very real way, and so hungry, in fact, that there appears to have been turning into a kind of ascetic. They were, in some respects, giving up on their marriages. You can read about this in chapter 7. They were also, how shall I say this, giving up on their marital privileges. And Paul says, hang on, time out. You've got a responsibility to your husband and wife. And then we get into chapter 11, and again, they're hungry for connection with God, and they're hungry for a spiritual experience here. And in chapter 11, you've got them getting right into communion and getting into communion in an almost crazy way. And again, Paul says, time out, time out. We've got a responsibility to everyone around us. And in chapter 12, what we see again is they're hungry for the experience and reaching for tongues in the main to have that experience. And everybody's praying in tongues. And if we had a service like that this morning, then everybody would be going for it, and some would be able to connect, and maybe some wouldn't, and some would be like, oh, what's going on here, and things along those lines. And Paul says, again, time out. We've got responsibilities to build up our fellow church members, our fellow Christians. Now, as I was preparing this message, and there's plenty that I could talk on that's not on this, I started to wonder if whether or not we have done exactly the same thing, church. Now, of course, we have done this in a far more respectable, more orderly, more Baptist, more Kiwi way. But I wonder if we have let the personal spiritual experience get in the way of our duty and responsibility to minister to our fellow Christians. Now, this is just something that I'm thinking of. I'm putting it out there. You can test this. You can think about it and decide at the end whether you think I'm onto something here. But let me explain what I mean. So we divide our services up into what we are calling musical worship, and then there's kind of everything else. Now that's an easy, nice way for me to think about it, because you've all seen me up on stage, and so there's times when I'm playing my guitar and times when I'm not. Nice two very easy buckets there. So if I put this in the language that I have been using this morning, Those of us with our musical gifts, we create an environment to where people can connect with God. And that is a good thing, church. No question about that. And I hope you were able to appreciate it this morning. But even though we're doing it as a group, the vast majority of us are not able to participate or to bring our gifts in a real way. And if you can't connect, what do? Sit down, shut down, glaze over? I'm not sure. Now, when that finishes, someone comes up the front, and just so that I know you're following, this morning, that's me, what I'm doing now. And we talk for a while, or I talk for a while, and hopefully that builds up the church too. We bring a word of teaching, maybe prophecy if we look at the language of 1 Corinthians. And then usually that same person prays, we leave the room, some people go home, some go for coffee, some people connect, some people talk. We almost never call that part of the church worship. Yet that's the part where we're most able to bring something to help build up each other's. Okay? And the part right at the beginning of the church that I didn't even mention because I kind of said we haven't even started yet, but we're all connecting. That's the part where we can all bring something there. And so for the most of our services in the morning, it's only one person, or only a few people bringing their gifts so that the church can be edified and built up. And yep, it enables people to have their personal connection with God. And as I mentioned, that's a really powerful and important thing. And God can bring healing and God can bring transformation through those connections. But it does leave the majority of the church free from their responsibility to bring something to build up the church. And I think in that way we miss out on the privilege of service. The word that I started with, one of the places where it is used in the New Testament is in Romans chapter 9, where Paul lists the blessings of the Israelites. And he said the blessing was of service or of worship. Okay, the idea that they had a special place to minister to God. And these experience that we have while we're in musical worship, or the transformation that we undergo when somebody teaches or preaches and things, especially with the musical part, my insight on those is that those experiences, they can be really powerful and they can be really transforming. They can also fade really quite quickly. Okay? But a verse spoken to somebody at the right time, or a word of encouragement spoken to somebody at the right time, those get held by people for years. So Paul never says this in so many words, but it is very, very clear from this passage that worship happens in relationship. It's not just me connecting with God, it's me connecting with God and with everyone around me, and those connections that we have there. Greg hinted at this last week, because he pointed out the minor paradox that we have in Romans chapter 12, where we are all instructed to offer our bodies, plural, as a living sacrifice, singular. And the only way that we can do that, church, is by meeting together. Now, 1 Corinthians 12 does come in a section talking about how they met together, and it's one of the very few sections that we have in the New Testament that actually gives us an insight to what went on a Sunday morning in the New Testament times. Now, for brevity, I will start in chapter 12, and I'm just going to give you the 50,000-foot view. We're just going to do a flyover of these three chapters that we've got here. Starting in chapter 12 is a little bit of a cop-out because there's some important stuff that's happened in chapter 11. And as I mentioned, if you've missed some of those earlier chapters, then you've sort of missed this whole aspect that goes on here. But in chapter 12, Paul starts off with this section on spiritual gifts, okay? Making the point that the Spirit gives something to everyone. Not just a few, but give something to everyone, and something different to everyone is the key. We're all different because we all have a different part to play in the church. Now, in chapter 13, you've got this very famous passage on love, okay? I've preached on this before. It's mostly completely misinterpreted. It's read at weddings. It is not to do with weddings. It is to do with how we all behave in church, okay? It's there to point out how we apply those gifts, how we be part of the body, okay? And just as importantly in the context of 1 Corinthians, how we don't apply our gifts, okay? Because bringing tongues to all of the people all of the time was not working very well for the church in Corinth. In chapter 14, Paul weaves both of those two threads together. He takes the spiritual gift from chapter 12, he takes the love from chapter 13, and he says, okay, here's how we apply those in the context of what happens on a Sunday morning when we meet together. Now, I could spend a lot of time unpacking chapter 13 and why it's obviously the most important, starting with at the end of that chapter 12 where Paul says, and now I will show you the most excellent way. I would carry on to then talk about how he finishes chapter 13 where he says love is the greatest. You kind of can't miss it at that particular point. And then again at the beginning of chapter 14. Now there is more to it than that. I am leaving out about, I don't know, at least 2 or 3 different things about why love is the most important thing that's in there. But like I said, I've preached on that before, so I'm not going to rehash that material. All I'm going to do is go back to our graphic and I'm going to update it one more time. So what do we have? Therefore worship, which as I mentioned, we need to unpack to therefore serve. Something strange happens when I use that word serve, because suddenly it's not clear who I'm serving, okay? Now, absolutely it's God when I use that same word that we have for worship. But also, from 1 Corinthians, we need to be serving one another. Now, what is the appropriate way to do that in light of what we have in chapter 13? Well, therefore we need to love one another. High bar. Hard bar. Now, going back to my earlier point, the way that we structure our services here at Hills enables the vast majority of us to offload that need to love one another and to build one another up, okay? Quite easy to come to church, sit down, worship, listen to a sermon or two, walk out the door. I know I've done it many times, okay? You know. When you're up here, you also wind up preaching to yourself. Put another way, most of us can ignore everyone else while we connect with God in a very personal way. And as I mentioned, there's value in that experience. And maybe us sitting there quietly and all alone is not necessarily damaging to our Christians, but it gets us off the hook in exactly the way that Paul said that we couldn't, because he said that each of us need to bring something, and each of us is there with a gift that needs to be there for the building up of the whole church. So if Paul were writing to Hillsborough, I think chapter 12 would include some fairly obvious statements. It would say, hey church, it's not just the music team that's responsible for building up the church. It's not just the speaker who's responsible for building up the church. Or maybe he'd say something like, hey church, I hear you're enabling people to come along and be passengers. Now, this is something that the world's megachurches could take a look at because they've kind of made an industry out of enabling people to be passengers. How would a chapter 13 look? Hills chapter 13. I think there'd be something in there that might say, love does not run out after the service is finished so quickly on a Sunday morning. That one's directly at me, okay? Because it's what I like to do. Love does not ignore one another. Love connects. Hills chapter 14 would say something along the lines of, there is more to meeting together than just music and sermons. And so when Paul does get to his summary in chapter 14, he is very clear that music is just one of many things that's done in a church to build it up, to worship. And the responsibility is far more collective than what we do on a given weekly basis. Let's take a look. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and verse 26. So, church family, what does all this mean? Whenever you meet together, each one should have something. A song, a word of teaching, a special revelation, prayer in a tongue, and an interpretation. And everything must be done for building each other up. Yes, our worship is what happens on a Sunday morning and involves personal connections with God. And there is something very powerful in those personal connections. But our worship also needs to be lived out in a life of service. A life of service to God, yeah. A life of service to each other. A life not just of respecting our fellow Christians, but of loving them. Because in chapter 13, Paul calls out pretty clearly that if you're serving things and you're doing all of these things and love's not there, it's pointless. And also in bringing something, an offering, bringing something to build up the church, bringing something to build up our fellow Christians. This is your reasonable worship.